Good morning, everyone. It is great to be here. Today is Friday, July 17th, and this is episode 21 of my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be speaking about a topic a bit impromptu. It is a topic that is very much in the news these days and has been in the news for some time. And no, I am not speaking explicitly, specifically about the coronavirus pandemic, but about an issue that is certainly, sadly, to some degree, interconnected with the current public health crisis here in this country. I am specifically referring to the issue of hate. Now, hate is a very contentious topic to speak about because of the nature of what hate is. And doing the reading that I try to do on a daily basis of the current news here in this country and throughout the world, one of the obvious fears with the coronavirus pandemic is that someone that you love or yourself, that you might catch it, that you might contract the coronavirus, become sick, and even potentially die, as now 138,000 Americans approximately have already died. So this is a very timely topic because we are living through a time here in the United States of America that has featured much upheaval, economic upheaval, social upheaval, employment upheaval, and public health upheaval. And when things become disrupted, one sadly all too common response to significant crisis and upheaval is sometimes for people to scapegoat others or deny the reality of what is happening or become angry with other populations of people and seek to blame them for the problems that all of us are facing, even though it's quite clear we are all going through this current crisis with different levels of resilience and resources and knowledge regarding how to survive this very contentious time. So my decision to focus on hate this morning was actually inspired by a New York Times opinion piece that I read this morning. I will include the link to that piece in the box with details about this episode. The article basically focused on the life of a woman who spent much of her time in her late 20s and 30s, early 30s, involved in the white nationalist, white supremacist movement here in the United States of America. I'm not going to go into great details of what the opinion piece features. You're welcome to read that for yourself. But as I read the piece myself, one of the things that struck me was the fact that in order to really address the issue of hate, not just in the United States of America, but overseas everywhere, we have to make an effort to understand what hate is and what causes us humans to hate one another. I want to share a bit more about my story, my personal background, so that you have a context for my understanding and my stance on the issue of hate. Some of this will be a bit of a reprise of some of my earliest episodes when I was first providing content on my background. I will, in future episodes, continue to provide more background on my own life history and experiences so that you, my viewers, can better understand my perspective on things. So, as I have noted previously, I have heritage from the German and the Dutch people of Europe. That is where my ancestors originated from. My father is an American citizen. My mother is a German citizen. She lives in northwest Germany in Nordrhein-Westfalen, or North Rhine-Westphalia, as we would say in English. And my parents met in 1970 when my father was a student studying in Vienna, Austria. And ironically enough, my father met my future mother when he was doing research into my dad's mother's ancestral heritage. so my paternal grandmother's family background. They met in 1970, and they were married on December 29th of 1970 in the small town that my mother grew up in Germany. Now, one of the reasons that hate has interested me, obviously, is that, like any German man who might take an interest in their history, their heritage, the history of the country that is today known as Germany, you have to look at hate, because hate was a major feature, obviously, of the Nazi regime during the Third Reich time in Germany. And this period in Germany was a very destructive time. The social fabric of the country was effectively shredded, and the country emerged from that war with a lot of rubble and a lot of destroyed lives. And as anyone who has even a basic understanding of European history in the 20th century can tell you, it was one of the most significant and historically significant events in 20th century European history. The Second World War basically set the stage for a radically new post-war world that thankfully ushered in a period of prolonged peace and prosperity for many decades thereafter. But the damage done by the war was not something that was instantaneously healed. And interestingly enough, as something that might be somewhat of a tangent, it was not until I was in graduate school and taking a graduate school level German language class that I did some additional research as part of the class and learned things that I never learned in my high school German classes nor in my undergraduate studies. And that is that East Germany, when it existed as its own sovereign state, had a whole economy built around having other states send their toxic waste and related garbage to be dumped within the borders of East Germany. And so when the two countries were reunified in 1990, the West Germans found themselves with a colossal task, namely of remediating the immense environmental damage that had been done to the former East Germany through all of those years in which they willingly took toxic waste from other countries and buried it, disposed of it within their borders. And so that remediation process was incredibly expensive. One moment. It's the morning planes, yay! That process of remediation was incredibly expensive. And I remember looking at the total cost of it and being, thunderstruck by the cost of remediating the former East Germany to bring it up to the environmental standards that the West German nation had enjoyed for a number of years prior to the reunification of the country. So, why am I talking about toxic waste in Germany in relation to hate? I'm talking about it because hate, like toxic waste, is a toxic element in society. Hate is something that, in large quantities, among millions of people, can radically change the course of history. And that's what happened with Germany, is they found themselves under the leadership of a man who led them into an abyss of destruction and chaos and suffering. And there's another plane. So, an abyss of pain, suffering, and darkness. That was what Germany was basically cast into after World War II ended. And in a similar way, I would argue, hate is what drives many into an abyss of their own, both as individuals and as collectives. And hate groups have been on the rise here in the United States of America in the last several years. And I think it is a very fair thing to conclude, based on what I've read and researched, that the explosion in the number of hate groups in this country in the last several years has been made possible in part by the current president that we have, Donald Trump. Not in my entire life history have I ever, in the United States of America, lived in a time with a leader who inspired so little confidence and so little hopefulness in me, and who has inspired so much hate and bigotry and white entitlement as what Donald Trump has done in the 3.5 years he has been in office. So a little bit more about my history. So my mother was born after the war had ended, and another interesting thing that I learned when I was taking a German class in graduate school was how difficult it was for many Germans of the time, young Germans after the war had ended, to have conversations, to have discussions with their parents and their families about the period of the Nazi regime. And no doubt the reasons for that resistance to discussion were some of the classic things that you would find if you study psychology. For example, those who had endured the war and had supported Hitler and then had paid the ultimate price in losing their property, their jobs, their financial resources, there was great suffering. And one of the things that is not uncommon in people who have suffered trauma is for those people to resist talking about it, to resist opening themselves up to sharing their stories, their lived experiences about their pain and suffering. Why? Because to do so is, in one sense, to relive the trauma. And trauma, by virtue of what it is not something pleasant. It's not something that people typically seek out to experience again. So in the aftermath of World War II, it was not at all uncommon for young Germans to find it very difficult to have meaningful conversations with their parents and the generation that had brought them into the world about the time of the Nazi regime in Germany. So not just because trauma is painful to relive would people be reticent to speak about it, but there's also many other feelings and issues related to going through a historic trauma like a war. For example, there's shame. I have no doubt that there were people, Germans at the time, who felt ashamed of what had happened to their country, and perhaps felt ashamed about their participation in that, even if it was tacit acceptance where they didn't support the regime, but they did not actively resist it either. So shame, a fear of reliving the trauma, these things can hinder conversations. Also, simply, there's the fact that when you have survived something as severe as a war, your priorities after surviving a war are typically, first and foremost, your very survival. And so if you are working really hard to recover from losing your home and your job and perhaps one of your very limbs, one of your priorities, namely talking about how you got to this point, is probably going to be a fairly low priority. You're going to be concerned first and foremost with, how am I going to eat? Where am I going to live? How will I keep myself from not sleeping outside and being cold or rained upon or snowed upon? So there's also just the very tangible, concrete reality of daily life, that after surviving something like that, you have to focus on surviving still further until you can improve your immediate world. So basically, there were many reasons for this reticence, and I bring this topic up and this part of my heritage because the power of hate especially when organized and directed in a focused way, can be extraordinarily destructive. And I know this not just because of my heritage as a man with a German mother and a German grandfather who fought in the war on the side of the Nazi regime. I know this not just because of my heritage, but because of my own lived experience as a young man growing up in Texas who was realizing in the 1990s that he was gay. And so I know about hatred because I've seen it a lot in the news the last several years, and also because I grew up around intolerance and small ideas when I was a kid in Texas in the 1980s and 1990s. So, the hatred or intolerance that I saw, it was never very much in my face. And that is because when I was growing up in Texas during my high school years and even when I was in college, I was very reticent to share fully who I was, even with some of my closest friends, whom I deeply trusted, because the culture of Texas is not fundamentally known as being the most welcoming culture. And I am being very soft when I use that language, when I frame it in those words. The culture that I grew up in had very strong conceptions of gender and gender norms, what men should do, what women should do. And being a gay man, being a non sexual orientation conforming person, didn't really have a place. There wasn't a place between these conceptions of masculinity and femininity for me as a young gay man to place myself and have a sense of self in that culture. And that is partly what motivated my choice to leave Texas once I completed my undergraduate degree. I knew that there were many other places in the world, and I knew this partly because I had the privilege of seeing my German family while I was growing up on numerous occasions and experiencing what modern Germany was like. And I was very impressed because in modern Germany and in West Germany, because I am old enough to have gone to visit my relatives when West Germany was a state, I remember it as a place of social cohesiveness and peacefulness and a high quality of life. And yes, even at that time, it would be untrue to say that there was no hate in Germany, that there was no far right neo Nazi interest and energy in Germany. That would be incorrect to say that. So even while there was significant prosperity, that did not mean that there was not an underbelly of discontent in Germany, even at the high watermark of its prosperity prior to the time that West Germany and East Germany reunified as one state. When I was in high school, I genuinely feared on some days that I would be physically assaulted because I was one of those kids that physically grew later. It was not until about my junior year that I physically grew, had my growth spurt, and started to reach the height and size that I am as an adult. So I was one of those kids that, for the first couple years of high school, was looking around at some of the other kids who were already 6 feet tall and only 16 or 15 years old. So that made it even more challenging to navigate the world when some of the people around me had a good six inches on me. So there was that culture that I lived in. And at the time, being gay was still very much frowned upon and very commonly misunderstood. It wasn't really until the 1990s that things began to significantly change in this country. The 80s were a time when the gay community had battled through the scourge of the AIDS epidemic and had emerged from that period scarred and brutalized and suffering and sad and lonely and wondering how to recover. The AIDS epidemic was a trauma for the LGBT community, the way World War II was a trauma for much of Europe, as well as the Allies who fought to overcome the Nazi regime in Germany. So that's a little bit more about my experience of hate and intolerance in my own life history and the histories of my family. This era that we are living through is a very contentious and concerning era in my estimation. It evokes in my mind the history of the 1960s in the United States. And I was not alive in the 1960s, so I can only read about it in history books or talk to people who were alive then. And most of the people that travel in the circles that I travel in were also not alive in the 1960s or were small children. So for me, this current era evokes other periods of history that I was not alive for. And when we go through something that we have no analog for, no living analog to compare it against, that can be very disheartening, troubling, worrisome, anxiety provoking, confusing, infuriating, disillusioning. And I have been feeling many of those things: disillusionment, anger, outrage, disgust, and wondering what comes next. As an American citizen who has heritage that makes me a white American, it genuinely appalls me how much our country is struggling to unify, to face a common purpose of mere survival. This coronavirus pandemic is bringing out, like so many traumas tend to do, both the best of ourselves and the worst of ourselves. If you do a cursory scan of the media, you see stories about people intentionally spitting on one another, coughing on one another, refusing to wear masks in public. And you see stories about people helping their neighbors, people delivering food to the elderly, people giving up their place in line for people that maybe have a more urgent issue than they do, people donating their money, people donating their time, people unemployed deciding to embark on a radically different vision of their future because they feel the current times necessitate a radically different version of themselves to come into being. And that is partly what I have felt, is the need to become a very different person because the times that we are living through necessitate a radically different way of seeing ourselves and the world around us and the communities that we live in. That is what I see happening. I am trying to use this time of this pandemic to reinvent what I think of as my place in the world and what I can do for the world in the time that I have yet to be alive on this earth. And if there's one thing I would encourage my viewers to take away from this episode is to ponder how you can transform your life in a positive way in this era of confusion and pain and suffering and darkness and anxiety. What daily things can you do to keep your life as stable as possible, to be resilient in the face of so much suffering and confusion? And what can you do for others in your community? That is the challenge that we are all facing now. How can we move beyond this American cultural norm of excessive focus on our individual lives, our individual liberties, our individual rights, our individual needs, our individual thoughts, our individual goals, how can we move beyond the self to think of and encompass not just ourselves, but our neighbors, literally our neighbors, the people that live next to us, the people that live throughout our community, the people who live in our state, the people who live in our nation, the people who live outside of our borders. Because if there's one thing that this virus, this pandemic has demonstrated, is that viruses and illness, they have no preference regarding who they cause trouble to. Viruses do not care about our borders. They do not care if you are male or female, transgendered, gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, whatever. They do not care if you are wealthy to the point that you could afford the most expensive medical care to recover from coronavirus infection. Viruses don't care if you are so poor that you have no money, no home, no food, and only the clothes on your back. Viruses do not care if you really wanted to take a vacation this year and you had been actually planning one for 5 years and had this amazing plan set up, and then you had to cancel all of it. This virus does not care if you want to go back to school in the fall and complete your graduate degree or your undergraduate degree. This virus does not care if the people that it impacts are children, runaway kids, children with immune system issues, unemployed adults, the elderly, people working 2 jobs, CEOs, janitors, lawyers, teachers, doctors, convenience store managers, grocery store workers. The virus does not care who you are. Whatever identity you have, it is not a shield against getting sick. It is not a shield of certainty that says you will never fall victim to this because of some part of your identity. And so I walk around in the world these days very much aware of that. That despite everything I have done and everything I have tried to be as a person, and despite all the goals that I have for myself, which are immense, the virus doesn't care. The virus does not care because the virus does not feel the way humans feel. The virus's goal, as so astutely described in a recent article, is only seeking to replicate itself. It's only seeking to find new human beings to make copies of itself to then send out and infect other people. That is what the virus is seeking to do. So to say that the virus is trying to hurt people or deliberately infect a certain population is a misnomer. And even if this virus had been engineered in some lab somewhere for the intentional purpose of harming a population of people, once it gets out, we humans do not have full control over such a thing. Just like if we seed the clouds of a hurricane, we don't necessarily have full control over the outcome of that action. So, this era is also an invitation to what I would say is humility. An awareness of the challenge of living even in the best of times, an awareness that we all have only so much knowledge every day, an awareness that we have only so much time every day, an awareness that because we have incomplete knowledge and finite time, everything that we experience can be taken as a learning experience to become a better person, or to at least live a better life if we don't want to think of ourselves as working to become a better person. So back finally to the topic of hate, to wind this up and synthesize all of this. Hate is something we are dealing with in the United States of America at this time. There is a lot of confusion and anger. There is a lot of hatred towards people not like ourselves being directed at other populations because it is convenient to scapegoat people during a national crisis such as what we find ourselves in now. But to scapegoat others and to hate upon others and to injure others and to kill others due to nothing more than a conviction that these people are hurting me without applying critical thinking to really ponder the sources of our individual suffering, the causes, the interconnection between different issues. To not ponder these things critically is to become careless and thus more easily perhaps persuaded to become a person who succumbs to a life defined by hate. And just, I'll give you an example, a theoretical example of the complexity of certain realities. Another sad thing happening right now related to the pandemic is the number of people that are housing insecure. The number of people who are going to lose their additional unemployment benefits by the end of July and become at serious risk of failing to pay any and all of their bills and going hungry and becoming homeless. It is a serious, nightmarish scenario that we are on the threshold of. And a lot of the people that become homeless, I would say, become homeless despite trying so hard to take care of themselves. There are many, many Americans out there who work more than one job to support themselves and their children. Some people work 60, 70, 80 hours in a week between 1, 2, or even 3 jobs to make ends meet. They work at minimum wage jobs with minimal security, financial security, and hourly security, meaning knowing they'll have a certain amount of work hours per week. There are so many Americans that work so very hard, and despite how hard they work, they have limited resources. Their health care insurance is perhaps fairly limited. They might have very few friends or family where they live. They may be taking care of family members, including their elderly parents, who have minimal incomes of their own. Some of these people might have come from overseas originally as children, like the DACA recipients. There are immigrants who have come here from many different parts of the world over the last decade, who sought to create a better life for themselves here and have been working tooth and nail to do so. And still, despite all of their hard work, they're living on the edge. It's not through any intention of their own that they are living on the edge. They are living on the edge because the systems in place in this country are not sufficiently robust enough to ensure that they are not living near the ragged edge of an abyss of poverty and unemployment and pain and depression. So, what I want to challenge my viewers to do today, besides consider how we can individually transform our lives, is to ponder the complexity of people's lives, of the factors that contribute to the way people's lives evolve. Consider the pine tree behind me in this episode. The pine tree is a synthesis of many, many things. There are many factors that have to come together to keep this one tree alive in the world. Sunshine, water, soil to grow in, an appropriate range of temperatures, an appropriate larger environment where things like humans don't come along and cut it down. So there is so much complexity in the world that is there for us to see when we have the eyes to see it. And so in regards to hate, I challenge you, my viewers, to consider the complexity not just of your own life, but of the lives of the people that you interact with each day. Your family, your friends, your colleagues at work. Consider that complexity when you ponder how to live your own life and how to respond to the challenges of hatred and division, which we are now so sadly confronted with quite often in this country, the United States of America. So, on that note, I'm going to close today's episode. Thank you to everyone for watching my episode. I greatly appreciate your viewing, and I also appreciate you telling your friends and family and colleagues about me. This is an ongoing creative project of my own that I intend to pursue indefinitely, as it is a great outlet for me. And as I said in my introduction many episodes ago, the purpose of my channel is to inspire, educate, and entertain my viewers. So I hope I've done that for you today. I'll be back as soon as I can with another episode. You enjoy your Friday, and thank you again for watching.